My dear brothers and sisters, greetings to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. It's my privilege to pass on to you the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. In this series on yoga education and spirituality, as a part of the celebrations of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th year of India's independence, today we shall be talking about one of the major schools of yoga, and that is Raja Yoga, also known as Patanjali's Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga. And within that, amongst the Ashtanga or the 8 limbs, today we shall talk about the first limb, the Yamas, which are a set of restraints. Just to recapitulate, yoga is a journey towards self-perfection. Self-perfection that includes both the perfection of the body and the mind. Raja Yoga is that school of yoga which emphasizes mental perfection or perfection of the mind. And the classic text of Raja Yoga is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and a beautiful translation and commentary in English by Swami Vivekananda is available under the title Raja Yoga, Conquering the Internal Nature. Raja Yoga concentrates on perfection of the mind, and if one applies oneself to it completely with full dedication, the possibilities are enormous. One can develop the abilities to know what is going on thousands of miles away. One can read somebody else's mind. One can know one's past far back into previous lives, as well as one can look afar into the future. But these are the type of possibilities called by Patanjali the Siddhis, or different types of powers that a person may acquire through this practice. But firstly, the common man is not interested in these necessarily, and in any case he does not have the type of time that is required for reaching that level of mental perfection. Secondly, Patanjali himself wants that one may acquire those siddhis, those powers, but they should not be used, because then there would be a tendency to exhibit them, to demonstrate them, to get the feeling that I am one notch above the rest of the humanity, and all these things would be ego boosters. And that is not something which is in keeping with the spirit of yoga, and therefore one should not exhibit these powers, one should not demonstrate them, one should not in fact therefore use them or apply them in practice. They are a byproduct and should be treated that way, and it's only by treating it as a mere byproduct and not the end of the journey that the person can go to the next stage, which Patanjali calls Kaivalya, or total liberation or isolation from the usual bondages and limitations of the human existence. While all these possibilities are astounding, the weakness of Raja Yoga also issues from the same, that since the temptation is to reach that level of perfection, which would give us all those powers, it does not suit the common man. So that becomes a weakness, because everybody can't spare that much time to dedicate oneself to the practices of Raja Yoga. And suppose a person does it and spends all the time on acquiring these powers, staying secluded from the world and worldly life, then what use can he put these mental abilities to? Which means that he has no opportunity to actually use them, and therefore they stay with him. So this becomes a weakness of Raja Yoga. However, in moderation, the practice is wonderful, because then it would give the person the ability to concentrate better, to think better, and that is certainly in which we should be interested. So the significance of Raja Yoga is actually in that the body and the mind are both our instruments, and the mind being an important and human beings the major component of this body-mind complex, an instrument of which human beings are proud and use it maximally, and therefore the use of the mind, proper use of the mind, requires that it should be in a good shape. And if we use the principles of Raja Yoga in improving mental function or the function of the mind, it would help us in our everyday life, because whatever we do in that, we use not only the body but also the mind. So the application of the mind would become more effective if we have improved the performance of the mind through the principles of Raja Yoga. So this school of yogas called Raja Yoga has Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. It's a set of 192 sutras, which he had expressed in a very cryptic language. It's very succinct, just 1 or 2 lines each, and just less than 200 sutras. So it can make a very small pocket book. But at the same time, the depth to which he has gone is truly astounding. What he had done essentially was to put together as briefly as possible all what was known on the subject in his times, and in sort of compressing knowledge of enormous value within such a small volume. He has done a marvelous job, and that's why his sutras have become a classic in Raja Yoga. So essentially it's a compilation of all that was known in this area of knowledge till his times, and I don't think there is really much to add so far as that particular aspect of yoga is concerned even today. While doing so, he divided yoga into 8 steps or 8 limbs. 8 limbs is in fact better, because steps would mean that unless one has climbed the first step and completed everything that is required at the first step, one is not qualified to the second step. And if we treat it that way, then hardly anybody would be qualified to go even to the second or the third step. So these are not really steps, but limbs or components. Anga, is a component, a part. So these are 8 parts or 8 limbs or 8 components. And one can have a certain degree of parallel processing, continue with the 3rd and the 4th step while one is still on the first step and has not really achieved perfection even in the first step. But all the same, this division into 8 limbs has a great significance, because one might assume that since we are aiming at perfection of the mind, it would be talking mainly about meditation. Of course, meditation is the principal technique of Raja Yoga, but then Patanjali does not straight away jump into the meditative process. Instead, in the Ashtanga, the 8 limbs, the first limb is yama, which means restraints, a set of restraints or things that we should not do. And the first amongst these restraints is ahimsa or non-violence. Now, these yamas or restraints have to be followed not only in action, but also in word and thought. So word, thought, and deed, all 3 are important. For example, ahimsa doesn't just mean that we do not hit somebody. It also means that we do not harbor negative thoughts against somebody. We do not use foul language against somebody. So it's thoughts, word, and deed, all 3 are important. Man, vachan, and karma, as we call it in Hindi. Man is mind, vachan is what we speak, and karma is what we do physically. So in fact, in terms of yoga, a thought is also a karma. So just having a thought, if it's a negative thought, a negative karma has already been done. So it's all 3 are important. The next yama is satya, always speaking the truth. Doesn't look like a restraint, but one can put it like this, that not telling a lie, then it becomes a restraint. So the first ahimsa, no violence; satya, no lies. Now, again, if we think about satya with a little more refinement, one would find that it doesn't apply just to the ordinary way of looking at truth and falsehood, but one can go deeper than that. For example, if I decide to wear dark colored clothes, and the intention is that people should feel that I'm always wearing clean clothes, then the impression that I'm conveying is different from the reality. I have decided to wear dark colored clothes because they will not look dirty. I may go on wearing the same dress several times at intervals without washing it. It may not be clean, and the impression that I'm conveying is that I wear clean clothes. So if the impression conveyed is different from the reality, that also becomes a sort of a falsehood. So one can look at these in a sort of comprehensive way, and one can try to go deeper. So the more incisive we become, the more we realize how much is actually implied in these restraints. So these are the first two: non-violence and not telling a lie. The third yama or restraint is asteya, non-stealing. That is, not to steal anything. And again, here it's not just picking up something that doesn't belong to us, which is meant. Theft could be of several types. It could be stealing somebody's intellectual sort of property, as it's called these days, which means some creative thing which somebody else has produced, picking it up and calling it our own. So that is also a type of a theft. It could also mean not actually stealing something in the sense of picking it up and pocketing it, but just having the desire to possess it, because thought is also important. It's not just the deed. And this is what we call in Hindi nazar rakhna, kisi aur ki cheez pe nazar rakhna, to have an eye, keep an eye on somebody else's property, which means that possessing that desire and more or less being ready to get an opportunity to somehow get it, if possible, without going into the morality behind it. So one may never actually do it out of fear of the risks involved, but just to sort of harbor this type of a thought itself becomes a type of a theft. So that is asteya, that is non-stealing. The fourth restraint is brahmacharya. This requires a little more elaborate treatment because it is commonly misunderstood. Misunderstood in at least two ways. The usual way of looking at brahmacharya is that it means celibacy, no sex. Now, this is a limiting view in two ways. Firstly, brahmacharya applies not only to sex, but to sensory pleasures in general. For example, even food. So it applies to sensory pleasures in general. Secondly, it is not only about the act, but it is also about thought. Because if it were to be about the act itself, the act of sex itself, then it would mean that all married people automatically get disqualified from the practice of Raja Yoga. So it doesn't apply really in that sense, in this particular respect when it comes to sex. It doesn't apply to the act. It applies more to the thought here. Here, thought is more important than the deed. Now, what does thought being more important than the deed mean? At least two things. As the Bible says, if adultery has been committed in the mind, adultery has still been committed. So not to have it even in the mind. To have sex which is not legitimate. The second important thing is not to be attached to it, which means that one should not depend upon it as a source of pleasure. One should not depend upon sex or other sensory pleasures like food, etc., for our happiness. Which means that one can have them, one can consume them, one can't keep away from them completely. One may be able to keep away from sex, but one can't keep away from food. So one can't keep away from food, but it is possible not to be attached to food, particularly not to be attached to palatable food which we are very fond of, not to get attached to it. Again, it does not mean that we should never have it, because suppose I decide never to have anything that tastes good. or which I find very palatable. Then when food is in front of me, I deliberately make a choice not to take those things which I am fond of, and reminding myself that I have decided not to take tasty food. Now, if I'm doing that, firstly, I'll get a sense of pride, and arrogance rather. I'll feel that I have now risen one notch above the rest of humanity. See, palatable food is in front of me, and yet I can control myself. I will not take it. So it's a self-aggrandizement. Secondly, although I'm not taking that palatable food, I'm thinking about it all the same all the time. So thinking about it means that I'm still attached to it. This is something that we may call negative attachment. So negative attachment can be as bad as positive attachment. The important thing is not that I should not consume what I like. I should not consume the food that I find very palatable. The important thing is that I should not depend upon it as a source of happiness. And I should be sufficiently aloof, sufficiently indifferent to these minor pleasures of life to be able to concentrate on something better. This should not become an all-consuming passion with me. What I will eat and when I will have sex. I mean, these are the types of things which should not become a consuming passion. That is what is important. It should be just the opposite. When it is available, when it is appropriate, I use these things. But at the same time, when they are not there, I don't miss them. I should not miss palatable food if it is not available. I should be able to take whatever is available with a sense of gratitude. So it is overcoming the attachment which is more important. And how does it help us? It helps us because it conserves a lot of time, energy, attention, focus. It conserves it for something which may be more important than these fleeting pleasures. Because after all, how long do these things last? If I have taken something very palatable, the taste will last just a few minutes. And if I try to prolong it, say if I have taken something which I like the best at the end, which is the usual practice, and I try to prolong it by not rinsing my mouth, the dentist would tell me that this is bad for your teeth. You should rinse your mouth immediately after you've eaten. Which means that it cannot be a source of pleasure. Even this, I mean, it's not happiness anyway, it's just a pleasure. But even this pleasure cannot be prolonged beyond a point. And therefore, why not look for something which can be lasting, which can endure? And something which in itself cannot last, cannot become a source of lasting happiness. What is it that lasts the most? The eternal, the imperishable, the divine, the infinite. Now that is what is everlasting. So why not try to get attached to that and try to get that bliss from that source? And that is exactly what brahmacharya actually means. Brahma is the divine, charya is movement. So moving towards God, moving towards the divine. Now, one can move towards the divine only if one does not pay much attention to whatever may distract us or what may unnecessarily lead to frittering away of our limited energy and resources. So, because the time is limited, energy is limited, and it is limited even for many things which may be otherwise quite worthwhile. It is only by detaching ourselves from many of those things, particularly sensory pleasures, that we'll be able to concentrate our energies on what really matters. And if we have chosen what really matters to us is the divine, moving towards divine perfection, that is what self-perfection is about, essentially. That we try to make this imperfect instrument, the body-mind complex, we take it towards perfection. And perfection is identified with the divine. So that is what union with the divine is. So that is our goal. And so far as the mind is concerned, Lord Krishna has put it very beautifully in the Gita in one little expression, man mana bhava, be my-minded. So Lord Krishna, the divine, is telling his human disciple Arjun, be my-minded, which means mold your mind, transform your mind in such a way that you tend to feel and think the way I do. So, and is that possible? Yes, it may be a distant goal for us, but all the same, that goal is reachable because the divine is within us, and we just have to rent that barrier that divides this inner light, the light of our soul, which is our divine essence, from our surface mind. So if the surface mind gets enlightened by that hidden light within, then the mind will start working in this light of this divine guidance. It would feel that way, and it would think that way, and therefore it would act that way. So the type of choices we make would be the choices which are being made by our soul, the divine essence. And the soul does have that dynamic component, which Sri Aurobindo and the mother have called the psychic being. So it's possible for the dynamic aspect of the soul, the psychic being, to influence the body-mind complex. And if the mind has been influenced, if the mind has been won over, then the battle is over, because the body is a docile instrument. It will do what the mind is telling it to do. And therefore the important thing is to be divine-minded, as Lord Krishna is telling Arjuna. And that is possible only if we don't get distracted by these minor fleeting pleasures, because we can't have it both ways. We can't have everything. It requires a degree of concentration. And that concentration can come only if we understand the fleeting and flimsy and fragile nature of these fleeting pleasures, and therefore do not get attached to them. Some of them are essential for our survival. Some of them are essential for the survival of the species. But that doesn't mean that we start treating them as a source of pleasure and start getting dependent on them as a source of our pleasure. So it is this attachment that has to be avoided. It is this dependence that has to be avoided. And this is basically an inner work working on the mind. And it doesn't involve giving up as an act. So this is what brahmacharya essentially means. Developing a sense of detachment towards sensory pleasures and not becoming dependent upon them for our happiness, and therefore thereby conserving our energy and attention for moving towards the divine, so that the mind can get transformed and become more and more divine-minded, work more and more in light of our own divine essence, the soul. So that is essentially what brahmacharya is. The next restraint is aparigraha. Aparigraha literally means not adding to our possessions, not collecting more and more items, not hoarding things. And this is again something which is understandable in principle, but is becoming more and more difficult to apply in practice in today's world, because all advertising is essentially about motivating us to buy things that we don't really need. And they make all types of promises. If you use this particular cosmetic, you will be happy. If you sleep on this particular bed, you will be able to sleep very well, and so on and so forth. So, essentially, it is trying to portray all these different objects of desire as a source of happiness, and in pursuit of that happiness, inspiring us to buy those things. So all advertising, all the barrage of this type of ads, which we are now finding more and more in the press, in the hoardings, and in the social media and everywhere, all this actually is likely to distract us and not observe this practice of not adding to our possessions. In fact, some of them tell us it's human. It's human nature to want more. And therefore, you should go in for more and more. Then, there is that trick of what is called a planned obsolescence, which means that, it is planned right from the beginning by the industry that after a certain time, very short time, when they should come up with a new model with a few new features, so that the people would feel that, well, now it's time to change it. The old instrument is still working, and it's quite sufficient to meet our requirements. But since a new model has come, and there's a tendency, if we can afford it, to go for the best. Also a tendency to compete with others, keeping up with the Jones tendency. One may try to get something which we don't really need. And not only we end up buying things that we don't need, sometimes we buy them with the money that we don't have. And that is what all these credit cards are about. And that is how is, in fact, instead of getting the happiness which had been promised, which in any case did not reside in that object, we end up in misery because of spending more than we can afford. So one of the best ways to sort of disturb the peace of mind is to accumulate more and more at the expense of getting broke, and then wondering where is that happiness gone which had been promised in the advertisement. So aparigraha, not hoarding things, not collecting things, not trying to possess more than we need. And Sri Aurobindo is a beautiful example from his practical life, his real life. We have a very beautiful anecdote available. When he was teaching at Baroda during the period 1893 through 1905, he was getting, as a professor there, an amount of more than 500 rupees a month, which was a princely sum those days. And it was given in coins those days, not in the currency notes. So he would just put all this in a tray without counting it, and then leave that tray open for anybody to pick up whatever that person wanted. Because his principle was that if I keep for myself more than I really need, I'll call myself a thief. So he never wanted to accumulate things. He had all the money to live in luxury, but he never did throughout his life. So aparigraha. So these are the 5 restraints or the yamas of Raja Yoga, or the yamas of the Ashtanga, the 8-limbed yoga of Patanjali. We'll not go into the other 7 limbs, but you might be curious to know what they are. The second limb is niyama, which is a set of rules or principles or regulations to be followed. So yamas in a way is a set of don'ts, what not to do, and niyamas is a set of do's, what to do. And from asana onwards, we get a very comprehensive meditative technique. Asana is a posture. Meditation also starts with a posture. Pranayama, in relation to the 4th limb, pranayama, in relation to meditation, translates into slow breathing. And the 5th limb, pratyahara, is sensory withdrawal. That is, not paying attention to any sensory stimulus, including the thoughts that arise in the mind. And the 6th limb is dharana, or concentration, focusing. And the 7th limb is dhyana, or contemplation proper, or meditation proper. And this is a sort of a defocusing, during which one may have thoughts, but then those thoughts should be related to the theme of concentration during the dharana. So the mind is streamlined. The mind is flowing, but it is streamlined flow. If you see a stream of water flowing, it looks quite different from if you spill a little oil, that flows in a different way. So mind, normally, the chaotic mind is like the water flowing, whereas in dhyana, it is like a stream of oil flowing on when the oil has spilled over. So converting that chaotic mind into a streamlined mind is what happens during dhyana. And samadhi is not a part of the technique of meditation. Samadhi is the product. So we'll not talk about these today, but they'll be there in some other session. Arunima, you have any questions?
Yes, sir. The first restraint that we discussed was ahimsa, non-violence. So how do we reconcile this concept of non-violence with Lord Krishna advising Arjun to fight against his kin and family in the Gita?
Yes, that's a good question. And sometimes people find it difficult to understand and reconcile with it, and then they try and give it a twist that it is not the outer battle that Lord Krishna meant. He was telling Arjun to find the battle within, battle with our negative tendencies like anger and greed and lust and so on. But in fact, there was a war waiting to happen, and Lord Krishna actually advised him, because he was hesitant. Arjun was very hesitant because he was going to fight his own kith and kin. In front of him were his kith and kin, elderly people, even his teacher, Dronacharya. And therefore he thought, what use is it fighting for a kingdom? It was the battle for a kingdom, to regain the kingdom which belonged to Arjuna and his 4 brothers. So what use is it to gain that kingdom after killing all these people? It's not worth it, so I don't want to fight. So no, after being in the battlefield, he had developed cold feet and didn't want to fight. And Lord Krishna happened to be his charioteer. So he told him that I don't want to fight, when he saw all the forces arrayed on both sides. So this dialogue in the Gita, through which ultimately Lord Krishna succeeds in convincing Arjun to fight, looks a little paradoxical in a scripture like the Gita. And therefore this is a common question. But what we have to remember is a few things in relation to this. Firstly, those days there were a group of people, and even now we have armies. So something comparable to that. There were people who temperamentally were men of action, and their responsibility was to maintain law and order, and to fight against injustice, to fight against cruelty, to defend good from evil, to defend justice from injustice. So it was not a war that they were fighting for personal reasons. They didn't have to fight for personal reasons, but to save the society from evil and injustice, it was their duty to fight. So there was a small group of people reserved for this purpose, so that they could maintain the purity of the society, maintain the sanctity of the society. So Arjun belonged to that group of people as a Kshatriya. So it was his duty to defend justice against injustice. The Kauravas, the opponents, had been unjust in trying to pocket the entire kingdom, which rightfully belonged to Arjun and his 4 brothers. So here there was an injustice involved, and Arjun was supposed to fight against it as a Kshatriya, not necessarily for personal reasons. And that is what Lord Krishna brings out in this, that it's not for personal reasons, but to set the right example in society, to do what your duty is, that you should be doing it. So do it as a duty. So that is one thing. Secondly, what is important is to also keep in mind that war was not used as the first option. After every other alternative had been tried, and the opponents had not agreed, the leader of the Kauravas, Duryodhan, said that I will not give to the Pandavas even the land which would be occupied by the point of a needle. So all options had been tried, and the Kauravas had rejected them. So it was being used as the last option. And thirdly, it was a war which was being fought in keeping with the practices of those days, the fair practices, which means it was a war which was being fought in keeping with the usual rules and regulations of a war. It was not that you were just taking the enemy by surprise like a terrorist and just going killing a few people. It was an open war. It had been declared. Both the armies are facing each other, and they have certain principles within the framework of which they would fight the war. And finally, from the spiritual angle, particularly, what Lord Krishna tells him is that firstly, you are only an instrument of mine to carry this out. So far as the Kauravas are concerned, for all practical purposes, they are already dead, because I have decided that they have to die. So in fact, the outcome had already been decided. So he told him that I love you, and therefore you just be a channel, an instrument for accomplishing it. I want that you should win the glory of having fought the war. But basically, you are only an instrument, a channel for my force to put into effect, to translate into action a decision that I have already taken. So, firstly, he was fighting only as an instrument. Secondly, he told him not to be attached to the outcome, that you should not be attached to the outcome because the outcome has been determined by me, and therefore you should not be attached to it. In this case, of course, the outcome was what Arjun would have also wanted if he was going to fight the war. But this is a general principle which emerges from the Gita, that the outcome may be just the opposite of what we want, and yet we should not be attached to it. We may expect the outcome, but we should not be attached to it. Thirdly, he was told that this is a rare opportunity which only a few Kshatriyas get, because if there is no war, you are sitting idle, and you do not naturally you would not want a war just because it is your duty. But then this opportunity, if it does come, then it is a rare opportunity for a Kshatriya to grow spiritually through it, because we grow spiritually through doing what we are in the world for, and the Kshatriya is there in the world to defend justice. So here you are getting an opportunity to do it. So this is the opportunity for you to fulfill the purpose of your life, which every Kshatriya doesn't get. And just to fulfill that purpose, a Kshatriya would not like to engineer a war or to create a war. But here, since it happens to be there, it is a rare opportunity that you are getting. So don't hesitate in making use of it. And then he also, of course, tells him the deeper truths of existence, that death is not the end of life. It is the beginning of a new life. And the soul itself is immortal. So it is only the bodily sheath that is perishable, but the divine essence of each individual will still continue to live, and therefore you don't have to really grieve. And finally, most important, he tells him that you have to do it, but do it out of hatred for the Kauravas, which means do it as a duty, but not because you have hatred against the Kauravas, you don't have anything against them. Because, as we saw, ahimsa is not only in the deed, it is also in thought and word. So in your thoughts, ahimsa in thoughts would translate into hatred. So don't have hatred for the Kauravas, fight the war without the hatred. You love the divine within all of them. You may not like the surface, but you know that the surface reality may require that you fight if it is your duty to fight, but you also see the divinity in those whom you are fighting, and then you would not hate them. So if we keep all these things in mind, then the war becomes justifiable, and in fact becomes a great source of understanding some general principles of life as well as the deeper truths of existence. So that's how what emerges from the Gita, and that is, it's to bring out all these things clearly, that the Gita had to go on for so long. It has about 700 verses. If Arjun is asking for advice whether or not to fight, Sri Krishna could have just told him that you fight, and the Gita would have been over. The reason Gita had to be 700 verses long is precisely because all these principles have also been enunciated, why the Lord Krishna was advising him to fight, and how it could be justified in terms of the highest and deepest truths of existence. Any more questions?
No, sir. Thank you so much for answering that. Thanks a lot.
You'll find this material in this book, A Primer on Yoga, in the 3rd chapter, which is on Raja Yoga. The first few pages are on the yamas. This is a picture postcard view of Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place where I live and work, and you're almost welcome here. And if you have any more questions or comments, or you want these slides, or you want the Ashram magazines, which are completely free, to arrive in your inbox on email, please feel free to send me an email to contact me on sa150yes@gmail.com, SA for Sri Aurobindo. 150 because it is his 150th birth anniversary. Yes, the program, Yoga, Education and Spirituality. SA150 yes@gmail.com. My gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making this possible. And thank you all for listening to the end. Thank you.